Let's talk a little bit about the Taliban's war on women. Candice, you wrote about this for us recently. So there's been all these incredibly draconian restrictions on women's freedom that have come through in the past few weeks. Do you want to tell us what has been restricted, first of all?
This is just a complete banning of women in public space in Afghanistan. I mean, we're familiar with, in Afghanistan, the Taliban of the past, women wore a full veil. This is even more extreme. They have to cover their face and their hands. Their voice is not allowed to be heard in public. Reading aloud and singing are completely banned. They've been banned from working. They've been banned from education. They're not allowed to look at men that they're not related to. I mean, it's just the most abusive Handmaid's Tale-like thing you can imagine, but it's actually happened. I mean, this dystopia has actually come true. And I think that anyone who knows anything about the Taliban would not have been too surprised by this.
Yeah.
But what's been amazing to see by a lot of the international liberal organizations is they've sort of tried to portray the Taliban as reformed in some way, or that there are issues with women's rights, but you know what, we're working with them on it. And over time, they'll gradually align with global norms. That hasn't happened. The exact opposite has happened. They've gone in completely the other direction. And you just wonder what is going on there. You know, why have liberal institutions blinded themselves to the reality of the Taliban? But I think we see this a lot with Islamic extremism. I mean, this is a trend. This is what they do. They never really describe it as it is. It's almost as if it's like the monkeys, you know, it's see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Yeah.
Tom, I mean, I wanted to ask you about the Western reaction has been utterly pathetic.
There
hasn't been anywhere near the outcry you might expect for something as extreme and as appalling as this.
And as you've already been outlining there, there's the sort of weakness of the statements from the International Human Rights Organization, and then there's organizations, and then there's the general sort of silence from the sort of liberal left activist class who can't really compute this issue. Now, I think it's worth saying that there's a fair amount of kind of old school feminists and women's liberation types who are very concerned about this issue and do talk about it. But unfortunately, they find themselves increasingly isolated, not least because of a lot of the positions those feminists tend to take on other issues, shall we say, which have made them persona non grata. But amongst the left more broadly, there is a deafening silence on this. And I really think there's no explanation for it other than the fact that within the sort of hierarchy of victimhood, they have a real problem with the oppression of women under Islamist extremist regimes. Like it doesn't really work in the really simple black and white ideology. It's only really oppression within Western countries or at the behest of Western countries or as a consequence of Western imperial activities that is worth talking about. But something which is more homegrown in other parts of the world is best ignored. I mean, I think there's a general feeling that if you talk too loudly and passionately about the issues that are faced by women, not just in Afghanistan, but in many other countries, that you will be basically engaging in a kind of Islamophobic dog whistle to do so. Like that is something that is really true. It's not to say that if you cornered someone who was of a sort of Corbynista bent and said, do you think this is messed up? I'm sure they would say yes. But they're not going to talk about it, not going to address a meeting about it. They're not going to go and make a lot of noise about this. And it really doesn't add up because on one hand, people will say, well, you know, I'm focused on what my own government is doing and what the West is doing and so on. These are people who obsess almost to an unhealthy degree about conflicts in other parts of the world, which they barely understand. But after a quick Wikipedia are quite happy to go on television and talk about it. So the idea that this just doesn't figure in their day-to-day activities as they trundle from one picket, from one discussion, from one TV debate after another, I think just speaks to the fact that despite all these claims to be really concerned about minorities and despite this claim to be really concerned about the oppressed, if you're talking about the minorities within the minorities or if you're talking about the oppressed women in Afghanistan, they just, for fear of looking bad in public, won't say anything about it.
Yeah, the minorities within a minorities point is really important because you'd think that intersectionalism would understand that, you know, women in, say, because it applies just as much in Britain as well, you know, women who have to wear the veil or the burqa or something, you'd think it would be understanding, well, they're oppressed as women and possibly oppressed as Muslims or whatever. But if it's the Muslim part that's doing the oppressing, you know, we barely talk about it. I suppose maybe the silence is preferable, then at least we don't have queers for the Taliban like we do have queers for Hamas.
Don't give them ideas though.
Sorry, yeah.
It'll be a matter of time.
Do you know, that's such a good point, because I think there's been a resurgence in interest in the case of Banaz Mahmoud, who was killed in an honor killing here. I think it was maybe about 15 years ago. There was a Netflix film made about it called Honor that was really realistic about it, about what she faced. And she went numerous times to the police to ask for help, saying that her family are trying to kill her, and nothing was ever done about it until the absolute worst happened. And then you got a very determined policewoman who decided she was going to get justice for Banaz. But I think that's so true, and it sort of left her sort of to the mercy of a culture that no one wanted to criticize.
Yeah.
But universally, she is a woman who deserves rights just like everyone else, and the same recognition, equal recognition.
Yeah, definitely. And you see similar things like that in Britain with, it wasn't just white girls who were victimized by grooming gangs, or, many of the victims of Islamist extremism in Britain are Muslims, often dissenting Muslim sects.
Yes.
People have been murdered for being of the wrong Islamic sect in Britain, but we can't really talk about that because that would be seen as, being too harsh on Islam or too harsh on Islamists even. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, the case of Salman Rushdie proves that as well.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, I think that's absolutely right. One thing that I've written a lot about in recent months is the whole kind of blasphemy issue in the UK, which is one thing that often gets framed very much along the lines of, well, this is a bunch of white British racists who want the excuse and carte blanche to just be mocking Muhammad and to draw Muhammad to try and engender this kind of response for nefarious hard right reasons. Over the course of the past couple of decades, to my knowledge, the only two people who have been killed as a consequence of anti-Islamic blasphemy, so-called, were Muslims themselves.
Yeah.
There was one dissenting cleric and an Ahmadi Muslim who, both in this country, but also most apocalyptically in Pakistan, have been the focus really of the whole anti-blasphemy campaign because of the fact that they are considered to be constitutionally within that country heretics. So it's one of those things where all of these claims about what the left claims to care about don't really match up when you actually see the kind of barbarism which is being inflicted on Muslims themselves. But because it doesn't compute, they don't want to talk about it.